Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Seen and Heard podcast, a conversational series. I'm Chris Braitch, and today I have the great honour of talking to Sara Warner. Sara Warner is a humanistic integrative counsellor and internal family systems therapist. She has specialised in working with ex-boarders since 2017, when she completed Nick Duffell's Unmaking of Them training, and also specialised in working with adult children of narcissistic parents and family estrangement. As a former solicitor and yoga teacher, she brings wide experience to her practice. Her approach is to explore what has happened to her clients, not what is wrong with them, so that they can be in compassionate experience with themselves and create a life which feels interesting and meaningful. She didn't board, but both her parents did. Welcome, Sara Warner.
Hi, Chris. Really nice to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining today. I've really enjoyed our conversations and interactions over the last 6 months or so, since we spoke originally for bringing you on board as one of our specialist therapists, counsellors and coaches that are within the directory that we have on Seen and Heard. And as our conversations progressed, we found that we had real shared interest as well in, for me, archetypal psychology, and for you, internal family systems, ways of that we make sense of our inner world. So yeah, really looking forward to the conversation today, and thank you so much for your time.
Great to be here.
Beautiful. Well, as I always like to do with the podcast, I like to get a real sense of who someone is, where they came from. So I'd love to hear a little bit about how things were for you when you were younger, and as you sort of transitioned through to bring you to the work that you now do.
Yeah. Well, as you've mentioned, both my parents boarded. I didn't actually go to boarding school, but I was privately educated in an all-girls school from 8 to 16, and then in a co-ed day school, both day schools, from 16 to 18. And, you know, I have my own experiences from being in that system. I didn't board, but I have been in that kind of education system. I've been in an all-female environment. I've been in the school I went to for sixth form was originally an all-boys school, where they'd introduce girls. So that was interesting in its own way. And I think I've always felt that the boarding school system has such a far reach and such a huge influence, not just, so we're not really talking just about boarding schools. We're talking about the children of people who boarded. We're talking about the way that other institutions are influenced by that system. So I've always felt that, do you know what I mean? Felt the reach of the kind of ideas and the principles behind it.
Yeah, thank you. I think you're very right that the reach is far and wide, and whether it's the grammar school system, sort of looking over the fences of the private schools, and then the state system looking over the fences of the grammar schools. These days, some might argue that actually there's a lot of very good things happening in the state system around emotional health and changes to the schooling itself, particularly in Scotland. But there's still very much the boarding and independent schools are kind of looked to within the sector. So thank you for sharing that, and that both of your parents were boarders as well. So as we in Seen and Heard, we work with past and present pupils, but also the families of people who went to boarding and independent schools. So we recognise that there is an impact out to the wider family unit, and then to the communities, and the nation and the world, as there's been such a huge export for the UK over the last few hundred years.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's enormous. And I was just also thinking about, people who've had bosses, partners, the list goes on. And I think that but one of the things that's very satisfying about this work is the ripple too. So in the same way that this system, the boarding school system, has a huge impact on the people in it, and I think, obviously with Piers has just done, and you were involved in that, the amazing film about, thinking about the impact on leaders, people who are making decisions in the world, but we're also thinking about people who are bringing up children, and that actually this work is so important because we're not just working with an individual, we're working with, do you know what I mean? They have, all of us are connected, all of us interact, do you know what I mean, across the board. And so I think it's one of the reasons that I have, that attracted me to kind of really specializing in this area.
Thank you very much. And so, in the bio, when I read a bit about the beginning, it talks about former solicitor and yoga teacher, and obviously now a counsellor and a specialist in this area. So, just how did that journey work for you? Kind of what came first, and what were the transitions between the roles?
Good question. So I was thinking about this earlier because I thought you might ask this, and always good to sort of really reflect on it. And I was so I became a lawyer to keep everyone happy in my family. That was kind of keeping fulfilling expectations. But there was a part of me in it too, which was about wanting to help people, wanting to do something helpful in the world for sure. Obviously, it's a very heady intellectual job rather than a heart job. And I think there came a point where actually it wasn't as satisfying to me to work in that field as it had been. And I also had some therapy, which in my sort of late 30s, which was really fantastic, really, really helpful, which kind of maybe planted that seed as well. And I started to get interested in yoga, which was really transformational for me. So, I've been brought up in this education system where it was all about working harder, pushing harder, doing things faster, better, all of this. And it was really the first time in my life that anyone had said, just let go, do less, stop trying. And as I say, that was really transformational for me. So I sort of think of my journey a bit as head with the lawyer stuff, and then I got really interested in yoga so much that I wanted to train as a teacher. So I then became, got very interested in the body, my body, other people's bodies. I taught for quite a long time, and and then I'd moved house for various reasons. I was looking to sort of work a bit more. My children were a bit older, and someone said, "Oh, what about becoming a therapist?" You're, and I thought, that seed had been planted. I'd had this really positive experience myself, really helpful. And anyway, so and I found a place where I could train, and haven't really looked back.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I can hear some, with the legal side of things, definitely wanting to help, and obviously coming back then into the middle role, sort of helping with the body with yoga, and now helping, body as well, but with the mind and with the sort of super system that is the human being. So you're really hearing a lot of interest in supporting others along the journey. And also, from the legal side of things, as we know, law is one of probably the highest over-indexing industries for people from the private school system, particularly boarding in the judiciary and things like that. But it's an area I know that interests a lot of people who come through the private sector. So there's something very left brain about private schooling, whether it's as a boarder or day pupil or whatever, and there's not a lot of right brain, or I say not a lot of right brain, or not a lot of heart. I believe things are improving now, but for decades it was very much a left brain IQ exercise, and that left many leaders, as you referenced Piers' film Boarding on Insanity, without the EQ, the emotional intelligence, the emotional capacity to, serve fully as leaders or as well-rounded members of society, if you like, without that connection to heart and right brain. So, yeah, can really
Yeah, and
hit.
I suppose just to finish with, around all of that, I suppose I do work with the body, as well as the mind in my therapy practice, and internal family systems actually is one of the approaches. Do you know what I mean? Which is body based, which in some ways is body based, if a person wants to work in that way. Yeah.
Well, we'll definitely get on to internal family systems in a bit. I think yoga you mentioned, that's been a really powerful part of my healing journey personally. I was very, very dissociated when I had my breakdown. I'd been very, very dissociated all my life, but as in so dissociated, I'd reached a point of depersonalization, derealization, which is, a sort of a loss of self, a loss of physical self in my case, and yoga and embodiment allowed me to connect in with my physical self again, which was a big part of, along with the therapy and the coaching and diet and exercise, all sorts of other things. But that yoga bit of, like you say, slowing down, meeting exactly what is there for you right now, not trying to be anything or do anything, but noticing, mindful awareness of the body, so powerful. Um, what did you see in your time as a yoga instructor, as far as not just bodily stuff, but bringing up emotions for people or helping them to deal with things that were going on in their lives?
Yeah, well, it was really interesting. I mean, obviously, though, I have my own personal experience of finding it quite transformational, both psychologically and physically. So I think it's very interesting. I think that do you know what I mean? We can think about working with the body having an impact on the mind, as well as the mind having an impact on the body. And I think, we really can think about, that actually our systems are quite complicated, but they're also very interlinked. And when I taught, I found it, fascinating how yoga would transform people. I would watch people changing before my eyes. I mean, not that it was a quick fix. And I think this is one of the things, that's really important with all of this. There is no quick fix for this kind of deep healing work that people engage in. And I'm really glad to hear, and not really surprised as well, that yoga's been a really important part of your personal healing journey, because I think that there is something incredibly important about becoming reconnected with our bodies. And boarding schools, of course, there's so much emphasis on the intellect and so much of a need to be focused outwards for survival reasons, for self-protection. And as you say, like your experience of doing some yoga actually really helped you to kind of bring your attention more inwards.
Yeah, I think you put that so beautifully. Actually, the constant sort of scanning of the savannah for danger, the hypervigilance, that tends to be a bit of a hallmark of an institutional upbringing. Not always, there's plenty of danger at home for people who are brought up, in a day school or home environment. But some of the captivity element that's around institutionalization or residential schooling is that can't really turn it off. There's not many doors to close and have that quiet time when the nervous system can settle, out of fight, flight, freeze and into parasympathetic and kind of relax and settle down. And so even the downtime, obviously in schools, was often heavily timetabled, regulated with sports and extracurricular and so you're never off. And I think the words you used early on really powerful, which is sort of more is not more, less is more, and you do need to sort of settle some of the stuff that's going on. Yeah, so yoga being a powerful one. I just wanted to mention that because we're often asked, what can I be doing? What should I be doing to help get over and not get over, sorry, to heal and integrate from stuff that's happened in the past. And one of the key difficulties is when people go and do an awful lot of very heady talk therapy and don't necessarily engage at any point with the body or um, with the right brain creativity side of things, etc. Do you have a view on that?
Well, I find it interesting because I often find that clients will instinctively, in a way, like start doing something body related. Obviously, we talk about about our bodies, what might be going on in the person I'm working with, what might be going on in their body. So I guess in the way that I work with people, I start to get people interested in it. I think that's part of it, is sort of getting interested. And I'm always just fascinated by the a kind of natural process of healing, and I will say to people, we're doing this, but it's also a really good idea to think about, doing something else with your body as well, whether, something that you like, something that you're interested in. So I've had people, that have done, cranial osteopathy, people that have started running, other people that do yoga. I think yoga is particularly, well, it depends what kind of yoga you're doing, but I would say that the kind of slower styles of yoga are really helpful. I would say that the sort of faster vinyasa flow types of yoga might not be as helpful. They'll help you get into your body, but they won't help you as much really pay that close attention that I think you were talking about. So I would look for a more hatha kind of yoga style if you're looking for a yoga class. I think it's really, healing. I mean, Bessel van der Kolk, his book, The Body Keeps the Score. I mean, he made it very clear that, healing trauma is not just about going to talking therapy. That's part of the process, but it's not the only thing.
Yes, yeah. You mentioned that wonderful book. It was life-changing for me and so many others out there. But I think I always urge people to consider the three elements, the emotional, physical, and the spiritual, part of kind of healing from trauma or self-development or improvement or whatever people want to call it, and that all three areas need to be given a little bit of a review and an overhaul and a look at. So thank you.
Yeah, and of course, Buddhism and those sorts of spiritual practices are often incredibly helpful for people. Yeah, I don't push any particular approach, but I would say I absolutely agree with you that a spirit, that there is some sort of sense of something bigger or something spiritual which is bigger than you, and might make you feel more part of something, have more of a sense of belonging and connection, I think is really helpful.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, it sort of doesn't matter what brand or flavor the spirituality is. It's all a very personal experience for people. And for me, I'm not religious, but found after being very much a devout, atheist, and being very left brain for most of my life, have found, some elements of Buddhism, some shamanic teachings, some from mainstream religion. And I kind of just mashed them all together into something that works for me. But when we come on to talk about our inner world, internal family systems, or archetypal psychology, the spirituality sits as a halo, sort of almost above the system. So as you say, there's the mind and the self, etc. But then if there is something greater than, then the being can then be of service to something greater than, and it creates a nice. I've seen it with my coaching and my personal journey. It creates a nice connection suddenly, as opposed to a dissociation and a disconnection.
Absolutely, yeah.
So as you transition through then, and you retrained, you felt you wanted to move into counselling. What was it about? You did the training with Nick Duffel, the unmaking of them, the sort of very well known therapists and counsellors training. What really drew you to that, and what have you got out of working with a lot of people who have boarded?
Mm. So I was kind of drawn to it in a way by the clients that came to me. So that's what originally happened. Was I started to get, and I was pretty early qualified. It was a time when there weren't any jobs for counsellors, so I found myself in private practice, whether I liked it or not, and started to get a few clients who'd been to boarding school, and I started to realise that this was quite complicated kind of trauma. I felt a bit in the dark about it. Had met a few boarders when I was growing up, playing sort of sports matches, but not, hadn't had that much contact with people who've been to boarding school. And so it was kind of an evolutionary thing, and it was in the process of trying to understand and read up about boarding schools and find out what was there that I came across Nick's training and thought, oh yeah, I'll do that. And then I think I have said this before, but it wasn't until I was filling in the application form for his training that I put together that my parents went to boarding school. So there was obviously, the unconscious is so interesting, the how we end up doing what we're doing. And I think, as I've said before, for me, working in this field feels incredibly important because it's so dominant in our culture. I would say that probably I have felt the effects of it and have spent a lot of my life undoing the effects of it. And so it feels, from that point of view, I think there's a sort of wide reach, there's a ripple, there's a, and being a therapist is such an interesting job because I think I learn so much. I get so much from the clients that I work with. I really feel that it's important that, I'm there. I'm not another expert. I'm not another teacher. I'm not someone who is there to know better than someone else. I'm there to help someone get in touch with who they are, to help help with the undoing, I guess. And I think that's, one of the things I was thinking about before this, before we got together this afternoon to have this conversation, was about how important the kind of not knowing is. That actually, the boarding school system is all about right, wrong, things are known, things are assumed, there's no space for kind of real complexity or kind of it's this and it's that. It tends to be quite a binary approach, I think. And I was watching, I don't know if you've seen the film Conclave, but there's a bit in that, great film, by the way, with Ralph Fiennes, and he's talking about uncertainty and the relationship between certainty and tolerance, and how actually certainty breeds intolerance. And so actually, in a way, as a therapist, I'm doing exactly what didn't happen at school. I don't know this person. I don't know what their experience is. I might have read a lot of books. I might be very specialized in this area of work, but I know that every single person's experience is their own. It's going to be unique. I'm very grateful for the literature and all the work that's been done, but I also think it's really important that I'm sitting there not knowing. And I think we're really acknowledging, I think the community is actually getting much better at acknowledging diversity of experience, state boarding schools, people from Black and ethnic minorities. There's a bit more interest in women's experience, people with different sexualities, that sort of thing. So it's not, so I think that's really helpful. But we've also got to think about, income, whether someone had a scholarship or not, can be very interesting. What kind of social background they came from, whether they were, in a very posh school, but from a military background, or a mercantile background, or whatever, where the business background, where it was a perk of the job, whether they came, So I think that's what I've really learned, is that actually what my clients really need is to have some individual attention, because that's what they didn't get at school.
Thank you. Yeah, you highlight so brilliantly there the diversity of the sort of boarding experience or residential school experience. I think too often it's the sort of the under 1%, if you like, which are the elite boarding schools, and it's the boys' experience, the male experience, that gets the focus. And so third culture kids, as you mentioned, mercantile, missionary, military, the state system, and we support people who came through what one man described to me as the naughty boy schools of the 70s, which were residential schools for people with behavioural difficulties. And it's a really broad church, and so can't be all typecast with kind of Eton and Harrow. And I think that's part of the work that we're all trying to do here, is to raise awareness of all the different experiences, and then raise awareness and a query in the nation as a whole. It's privilege ? Not privilege ! Or whatever it might be. So it's as to whether leaving home and being raised by an institution is a privilege or not. And because of so many of the experiences out there of neglect and abuse that occurred in institutions, I think we can safely say that it's a privilege with a very big question mark. So thank you for your personal view into that. One thing we talked about before was the challenges of of a professional like you working with people who've been through the boarding school system. We talked about shame. We talked about sort of blockers to the process of starting to see things more clearly and get some integration. Could you talk a little bit more about shame and some of those challenges that you come across?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think shame is absolutely huge for all humans. It's a normal feeling. It's something we all know what it is, whether we've been to a boarding school or not. And I think for people who've boarded, because of the intensity and the lack of a break and the lack of something alternative, there is also a kind of more sort of chronic shame, which can be a real barrier. And it's a shame of kind of being a normal human being. I think, it's you're shamed, if you're one of the early boarders, you will have been shamed for just being a child, just having, liking childish things, and this whole kind of idea of kind of mini adults, and this kind of crazy idea about let's make them independent, rather than love and care for them. I think that's a big aspect of it. And then, of course, adolescence, there's so much potential for shame in terms of a developing body and sexuality and all those sorts of things. So I think it's fundamental, and I think it's really important, because shame is the root, or parts of us that are trying to protect us from being shamed. And as shame is also really used in boarding schools to control. And that's kind of boarding schools across the board, in my experience, in terms of what I know from my clients. And when we've been shamed, that can result in lots of different sort of behaviours, which can be quite problematic. So shame is at the root of all sorts of behaviours. It can be at the root of, of a sort of freeze, a hiding away, a shutting down from the world, real reclusive behaviour. It can be at the root of addictions. It can be at the root of workaholism, achievement, Do you know what I mean? Achievement as a drug could be at the root of an addiction, could be at the root of all sorts of it could, and also be at the root of, sometimes it's so untouchable, it just has to be projected onto others. So if we can't, even if our shame is kind of like, it can't even be acknowledged, which I often think that's the case because it's so shameful to carry shame, then someone might, the only psychological thing that, do you know what I mean, their parts are able to do with it is to project it onto other people, or to maybe even become very aggressive if they feel shamed. And I think that one of the things that my heart, I do feel that there is something very damaging about being brought up in these kinds of institutions where shame is used to control you, and where any mistake can feel, do you know what I mean, mortifying, can feel sort of very threatening to your well-being. And that, that really kind of is something I think which is quite important for anyone who's going to work with borders to be aware of, that as a therapist, if I might put down a boundary in some kind of way around turning up on time, or do you know what I mean, or paying on time, or things like that, and I might inadvertently really trigger a shame button in my client. And it's taken me, so I think that's really important to understand and have compassion for.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it is such a big one, and in the last year we connected with 300 individuals through our sharing groups, and it's quite universal that what has stopped people looking at this topic, or looking at this part of their life, or addressing things that are not working for them in their lives, is shame. And it shows up as kind of I was very privileged, very fortunate, and therefore I've got nothing to complain about. That shows up a lot. The other one is, well, at least I wasn't abused, so I've really got nothing to complain about. So not recognizing the neglect side of things, the things that weren't there for you just because you dodged the worst of the sexual or violent sexual abuse or violence, etc. The use of shame was so endemic, it built into the system, that that we become sort of hypersensitive and hyper defensive to feedback, and whether that's self-feedback, self-inquiry, or the feedback of others. So for a lot of people that shows up at work, the slightest criticism from a colleague or boss or something, and a big shame spiral begins, and that can lead to conflict and rupture, and sort of words gone a little bit, but self-defeating, self-sabotaging in work or relationship, etc. And again, it's shame that's at the core of it. In my own therapy, it was I described it to my coaches, it was like a paywall behind which everything else was sat. So I had to work with the shame before I could get anywhere near the grief, the fear, and the anger, the core emotion stuff. And shame was still sat there. It wouldn't let me get anywhere near it to start with. And so I had to negotiate and work with that paywall. And I think that would lead us neatly on to talking about how we start to negotiate and understand our inner world. We talked about IFS.
Yeah, and it's interesting what you said about kind of, in a way, having to negotiate with that part of you that was kind of, in a way, not letting you go anywhere near. And IFS is very much about thinking about ourselves and thinking about our parts, and actually fundamentally one of the beautiful things about this way of working is that we work from the principle that there is no such thing as a bad part. Every part, that is there trying to do something to help you survive. It may not be, it may not be completely obvious, and that's why we start with we go along with this not knowing and curiosity, and I think IFS has really actually is changing the therapy world in this way, in terms of how we think about people and their parts, and instead of thinking of people of having being self-sabotaging, or do you know what I mean, having defenses which need to be got rid of, we start to sort of think about someone as a whole person. And I think this is really important, that we can help people to be in good relationship with themselves, so to be able to really understand why these parts exist. So shall I just explain a little bit about how the structure of the
That's great.
internal
I was
family?
just going to ask, if for those who haven't heard of IFS or internal family systems, if you could give us a top line of what it is and how it works, that would be great.
Yeah. So in internal family systems, basically the idea is that we all have a self energy, and our self energy we're all born with. It may not be easy to find initially, but we've all got it. And it's a part of us that is curious, courageous, patient, has perspective, maybe can hear both sides of an argument or something. It's a creative part of us. So there are, lots of really nice qualities that come with our self energy. And it's really important that that is kind of there at the core of us. And then what happens as we grow up is we develop various managing parts. And there are kind of two categories. There's the kind of ordinary managers, who are kind of called protectors or managers. And they might be the things like there might be a internal critic, there might be a perfectionist part, there might be a people-pleasing part. Conflict avoidance is quite a common thing. So various other parts. There might be an intellectual. I've got to think my way through everything. There may well be a part that dissociates. Well, there will be for actually pretty much everyone. In some ways, when things get too tough. And then there's another category of parts, which are the kind of emergency services, and they're called firefighters. And they really get engaged in our systems when there is a worry that we're going to be overwhelmed by difficult feelings. So it's not just a question of keeping the difficult feelings at bay by behaving in certain ways, but it's like, oh, actually help, we really might get overwhelmed by emotional pain at this point. And that's when we have people who, people might, there's all sorts of interesting things. People might feel depressed, people might sleep, people might turn to drugs or drink or those sorts of things. People might go into excessive exercise, excessive work. Eating disorders would be in this category. And I think what's really important to understand here is that we don't get a choice about how our parts develop in our system. So I think when we talk about shame, I think this is one of the things that's very helpful about IFS, is we can start to understand that actually whatever, maybe our system copes by, using alcohol, maybe someone else's system copes with, not eating or eating too much. Maybe someone else's system copes with, with over exercise or overwork. And I think it can be really helpful just to understand that, we don't get a choice in that. That will be as a result, that's organic in our system, depending upon, do you know what I mean, who we are and the environment we're in and what's happened to us. So you've got all those protecting parts, and what they're really protecting from, as I've mentioned, is kind of emotional overwhelm. So that too much emotional pain that was going to overwhelm and flood our system and cause us not to be able to function. And those kind of nuggets of emotional pain, in a way, are sort of held in little kind of encapsulated in what they call exiles. So exiles are the parts of us that carry the emotional pain and are very often shame, and which these managers and protectors are busy trying to keep at bay. Now, ultimately, what we really are aiming for in IFS is for the self energy to start taking care of these parts with emotional pain, to be an acceptance that we're humans and that we are going to feel sad sometimes, we're going to feel scared sometimes, we're going to feel angry sometimes, we're going to feel shame sometimes, and these are all quite normal human things to feel. And we don't need, do you know what I mean, this battery of managers and firefighters to come in and block these quite normal human experiences.
Thank you. That's a brilliant summary of IFS and how it works and the different parts. And I think that, as you say, that if when you're growing up, we accept that we come into the world with a kind of 360-degree personality, full of promise, and then society, whether that be family, primary caregivers, school, etc., sort of chip bits off and reshape certain parts and take certain parts away, always because when the child shows up with something, with their anger, their sadness, their fear, their joy, it's unwelcome to whoever's around them. So it could be the parents, it could be the school. And so they are shamed for that behavior. And ultimately, then that part of them is put away. In the sort of school that I practice is put into the shadow bag, or sort of, as you say, annexed off. And then, the young person think, "What, God, I can't do that again." That shame was so overwhelming, emotionally, physically, spiritually, that I can't go there again. Therefore, that part of me is now not something I can go, access and use and go there, and so it is shut away. So really helpful to understand that. So ultimately the healing process is not there's sort of nothing needs fixing, as it were. It's all still there. It just needs moving from the shadows into the light, integrating, and then the person can move to sort of wholeness again. Nothing is ever really lost. It's something that I often mention to clients. So thank you so much for your thoughts on that. Anything from what I've just said that you can build on there?
Well, I think it's really nice what you just said. And, it's interesting because I know you work in a slightly different way, but actually I think do you know what I mean? Like actually the kind of, conceptual model of the way that you work is very similar. Actually, it's a really similar, and I think it's so important, isn't it, because I think actually one thing I didn't mention was that, of course, the thing about shame is that it's a belief that is held by a part, or maybe part of us, that we are bad. It's not that something bad happened to us, but it's an essential belief that there is something bad, that we are bad. And there's something very beautiful about what you said about, like, well, no, it's all there. Actually, it's all there. All of it's there, all of it's welcome, all of it's and it really sort of helps to, do you know what I mean, in a way, dissolve this kind of very painful way of being that so many people who've bordered experience of existing in the world feeling that they're bad, when actually what's actually the truth of it is that bad things happen to them.
Yeah, thank you. That's so clear. Dr. Gabor Mate is a good one for sort of saying it's not what happened, it's what you made it mean, or what happens inside you as a result of what happened, and the belief that's made, which it could be, it's not safe to be myself. I am bad. The world is not safe. People cannot be trusted. These are the sort of beliefs that come with difficult events, particularly in childhood. Whether it's adverse childhood experiences or any kind of trauma, where it's the belief that runs long term. And often, when we're doing this kind of work with people, you might have to work back through the event. Sometimes you don't. Sometimes it is just dealing with understanding, what got put away, why it got put away, and making a decision to bring that part of you back into kind of awareness. So with with the IFS approach, then now that we know a little bit about it, could you just talk to us a little bit about how, so if someone's coming, things like adverse childhood experiences, boarding school syndrome, they don't, people don't tend to present with that. They present with stuff that's going wrong right now in their lives, depression, anxiety, divorce, grief, etc. So they'll show up with that, and then ultimately there's a process then. So could you talk us through that process for people to understand a little bit more?
Wow, yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, well, I mean, I guess the very first process, one of the very first processes with any client that comes to me is like thinking about the part of them wants to be there and the part that doesn't. So we might, so we're really working with parts. And I was actually thinking about that before, like, like I've got parts here today. I've got a part that wants to be perfect. I've got a part that doesn't feel good enough, that I've been kind of taking care of this morning before we had this conversation. So there's kind of might be specific boarding parts, but which are kind of useful to know about maybe like that, and I think often people feel that it's very, just for that to be acknowledged, that there is a part of them that doesn't want to be there. Might be a part of them that's really worried about getting it wrong, that they can't do therapy, that all they're, I think the thing about IFS, or it's like any kind of good therapy, and I want to really make that clear. I'm not like saying IFS is the only way at all, because there are, do you know what I mean? But I think it's really about really careful listening. Like, so you're helping clients start to really listen carefully to themselves and to do that, begin to do that internal work. Like, oh, I'm here. Okay, so what are the voices I've got going on inside me? Does that, yeah?
Oh, that's so powerful. I think I had when I just very recently had my breakdown, I was on a men's group, and one of the other people on the group just shared something which was, I am not my thoughts. And I thought, oh, that's a pithy, sort of bumper sticker comment. And then I took it away and explored it a bit. And actually, it was the first time I ever realized that there was, without any, I didn't know anything about psychology at the time, and nothing like that. But I realized there was the conscious stuff that I was running every day, 3 or 4% or whatever it is that's conscious, and then there was this enormous unconscious or subconscious, and all this stuff going on. And it's just started to make sense to me that when I had these shameful, scary, dark thoughts, they were just thoughts. It wasn't actually me. It was just a part of me, and therefore, actually, I didn't need to listen to the story that they were telling me. I didn't need to follow them down any rabbit holes, because ultimately they were a part of me. And what I practice, we say, even though I have this dark, intrusive thought, I deeply and completely love and accept myself. It's part of emotional freedom technique. So we're acknowledging that, I'm happy with this, warts and all, and that is just a thought. It's not who I am. It's not what I believe. It's not what I'm going to go out and do in the world. If I have a dark thought, see someone across the street, and I think, I wonder what would happen if I drove my car into them, that doesn't make me an awful person who's going to kill someone in my car. It's just a thought. And then you could get curious. I wonder where that came from. That's interesting. And ultimately, you love and accept it, and therefore not ashamed for having a thought like that. So, the I am not my thoughts, and therefore how you approach that in our IFS and with your work. Particularly intrusive thoughts and ruminations are kind of a key thing that shows up. How do you look at those in your work?
Well, we start to try and understand the part, so we start to be curious about it. So we start to sort of see it as a kind of almost like its own entity. If there's it's interesting what you were saying, that in a way that, and I think this is very true, that a lot of people aren't even conscious of their inner critics running, do you know what I mean, running this really negative dialogue through their system, do you know what I mean, a lot of the time. And that's kind of the first stage of the work, to sort of bring these things into awareness. And of course, our thoughts are not anything more than our thoughts, but we can start to understand maybe what function this part that is kind of overthinking, ruminating, obsessing might be up to. And, like, for example, a part like that might be just taking us away from reality. It might be dissociating. It might be just giving us a break. It might be giving us a sense that we can control something that we can't. But that actually, in the past, that might have been a really useful thing for our survival do you know what I mean? To understand, so I'm not saying, I can't say everyone's individual parts are different. We might, when we start to get curious about a part in IFS, we might try and find it in the body. Not for this is not to everyone's preference, and it's not the only way of doing it. But if people are comfortable to maybe like check in with their bodies and like, oh, there's a bit, I can feel something tight there, we might get interested in the sensations, and then we might get interested to see what thoughts come up alongside that, what memories might come up alongside that. So we might then find out from the part, how long it's been doing this for, why it's been doing it, what was the original trigger or triggers, that kind of thing. So it's a whole process of inquiry.
Well, thank you. Inquiry is a lovely word, isn't it? I think there's schools of therapy out there, compassionate self-inquiry, or self-compassion. But ultimately, and as you said, there's so many different types of therapy, and I know that we hear a lot. People get a little bit bamboozled by all the acronyms and IFS, EFT, EMDR, psychoanalytic versus Jungian versus psychodynamic, etc. As wow, that's a lot of terminology. Ultimately, it is just different ways, slightly different ways, often very, very similar ways to inquire compassionately about the self and what's going on. But IFS very beautifully creates something that I wanted to talk about a little bit and get your view on, which is one of the most difficult things when things aren't going right for you, you're not feeling well emotionally, physically, etc. Is you can feel very alone with the problem, with the burden. You could be alone in a crowd, and I've heard boarding school particularly described as lots of kind of little people on their own island, surrounded by people and this huge system, but everyone's effectively on their own in that experience. Things like internal family systems, or what I practice, archetypal psychology of king, warrior, magician, lover, or queen, warrior, magician, lover, they create a family, an inner world that becomes someone's own making. It looks and feels unique to every single different person, and therefore they're no longer alone. So it gives them a framework and a language from which to understand themselves. Done beautifully by the film Inside Out and Inside Out 2, etc. And how lovely what those films were. What's your view about how IFS gives people this sense of an inner world? That they
Well, I
can
think
lead.
it really helps people organize their inner worlds, or understand their inner worlds, make peace with their inner worlds, and be able to kind of, and I also actually, I haven't said this, but I think this is really, really important. One of the reasons I trained in IFS was because what I experienced was a real terror, understandable, of in terms of boarding clients, of going towards pain, emotional pain. And the fear of being overwhelmed and all of that. And one of the beauties of IFS is when we start to talk about a part, it's like not the whole person. So we're just talking about a part that's carrying the pain, and that suddenly, that was I actually did some IFS therapy myself first of all to see how I found this is kind of how I tested it out a bit before I did the training. And I personally also just, I use it all the time myself, like every day. It's a very, very nice system for checking in with yourself. And for just being able to manage perhaps those more intense, not just the difficult thoughts, but the difficult feelings, and be able to hold them as a part rather than the whole of you. And I think a lot of people find that really helpful.
Brilliant. Yes, thank you. One of the things when we were speaking before, we've touched on shame. One of the other bits that came through really strongly from our conversations was you mentioning that sort of boarding school can is similar to sort of being in an abusive relationship of some kind, and that really stuck with me. And I'd love to know a little bit more about that because it rang a chord with me. It struck a chord.
Yeah, well, I've been thinking about this for quite a long time. I think partly because so many of my clients have found themselves in that situation. So it's kind of sort of just been something that I've thought was sort of interesting. Or like, why is this? What makes people who've been to boarding school perhaps more vulnerable to these types of relationships than perhaps another client group? And I suppose fundamentally, it's this feeling, I am bad. You're much more vulnerable to being in an abusive relationship if you believe that you are fundamentally bad. And so we come back to shame again. So I think that's one thing. Being a boarder, you have to dissociate from your own needs because the needs of the institution are primary. So it's much more likely that you might find yourself in a relationship with someone who is clear about their needs. For you to be circling around, you'll have a much less strong sense of yourself, because this is one of the other tragedies of a boarding school education, is the lack of attunement, the lack of opportunity to really find out who you are. And that again makes you much more vulnerable to being gaslit, to being, to questioning yourself. And then, of course, very importantly, this will be the sort of parts that are terrified of conflict, don't know how to deal with conflict, can't, I mean, I've really come across, well, I come across this in both men and women in particular, but there's these parts that are very silencing and internalized, which internalize anger rather than externalize it. Does that make sense? So it's like kind of the anger gets really internalized. So our anger is there to protect us. It tells us someone has crossed a personal boundary. But, I find with many boarding clients, those experiences have led them to shut down, internalize that anger, maybe in an eating disorder, maybe in a depression. That's quite common. And kind of, and only be able to maybe be aggressive in a kind of more passive type of indirect kind of way. And of course, again, if you can't mobilize your anger to protect yourself, you're going to be much more vulnerable to being in a relationship with an antagonistic or exploitative person.
Thank you for sharing that. It draws a lot of lines across to what I see within the work, within the groups and things like that. Being in relationship. If you've had any sort of relational trauma or relational rupture as a young person in an institution outside it, the healing of that is better done in relationship, if you like. So whether that's with people around you, group work, as well as one-to-one work, it's a relational wounds that sort of needs to heal in relationship. The IFS system or archetypal stuff, it gives you a little family. It gives you relationships to start to build and work on, which is lovely. But the almost to the person, relationship issues in adulthood, particularly the romantic relationships, but often also with siblings and parents, is quite universally bumpy amongst people who've grown up in residential schools and things like that, and is one of the key factors. So it doesn't surprise me that then the relationships that do happen are sort of codependent or unhealthy in many ways, where someone who might be in a more kind of deflated anger, a passive aggressive might seek someone who's more um, who might seek someone who's controlling or bullying or more outward with their anger to be able to get things done for themselves, or recognizing parts in them that they aren't able to kind of access and work with themselves. So the emotionally abusive relationship, that's something that was key, I think, for you to bring forward.
Yeah,
Is there
and
anything
you
else
just
you
mentioned.
wanted to mention? Mm.
Yeah, well, you just mentioned bullying, and I think one of the things, there was that article in the Observer last weekend. I think it was last weekend or the weekend before, and it's always struck me, that bullying is so normalised. I mean, for people who've boarded, bullying is just, it's rife. I think every single piece mentioned bullying, what it was like to be there 24/7 in an environment. Do you know what I mean? Even if you're not being bullied, there's bullying happening around you. Of course, an abusive relationship is a relationship in which you're bullied in relationship. So that's another vulnerability, and I think that I think that has a profound effect. There's much more I could say, of course, but maybe we're coming up to time, and but yeah, I think they're just things that are worth talking about, worth thinking about, and worth kind of in a way getting people to I know we talked about wanting to do something helpful in this conversation, like we were. Do you know what I mean? The intention of the conversation is to sort of say something that might be helpful to people, and I think it's just like it might be good for some people to reflect on their relationships and whether they are in a relationship which is really meeting their needs or not, because I think that's not always the case. And I think the final thing I wanted to say was, of course, about the problem for having been abandoned by your parents, sent away or whatever it is that you've got a part of you which is very love starved, and it's young. It might be 8 years old, it might be 11 years old. And if that part of you is choosing your relationships, that's going to be problematic.
Thank you. Really, really powerful final thoughts as we start to bring things to a close. As you say, our intention was to we'll get to meet you and connect with you to understand a little bit more about IFS. And I think one of the biggest things I hear is I tried counselling once, didn't like it, or I had some CBT on the NHS and it didn't work for me. And then comes back the kind of shame again, which is I'm broken, I can't be fixed, it doesn't work for me, none of this stuff works. And I think in this discussion, we're just trying to shine light on how many different approaches there are out there, and the message being that you do have to sort of kiss a few frogs before you find the right one. So to try some things, there are some brilliant approaches like IFS, like EMDR, and like many other different types of therapy. So to keep looking and exploring and trying. Don't be scared of the acronyms. They are all pretty much similar things for getting to the same place, which is to bring the sort of unconscious into awareness, to understand it, where it comes from, give it a name, make friends with it, and ultimately to integrate it and move on in life and fulfill potential and have a happy existence. It's what we're all here to do. So, just as we start to finish now, Sarah, is there any final thoughts, or if people want to get hold of you and see your work, how can they reach you?
Well, I've got a website, and maybe I don't know if there's notes. Are there show notes?
There'll be show notes, yeah, but you're welcome to read it out.
Yeah. Stick it on the show notes. So they can get hold of me that way. Yeah. And I would absolutely want to say, like therapists come in all shapes and sizes. It's a relationship. If you're not comfortable with someone, find someone else. I think shopping around. I agree with you, Chris. Don't be frightened of the acronyms. And maybe think about doing something with your body as well, like so that something about not just therapy.
Beautiful. What a great way to end. So just want to say an enormous thank you to Sara Warner for your time, your energy, your work as well over the years, supporting people, whether it be as a solicitor, yoga, or now as a counsellor. A huge thanks to you for listening or watching today. I'm Chris Braitch. This has been the Seen and Heard podcast, a conversational series. And so we'll say goodbye to Sara Warner today and wish you all the very best for the rest of your day.
Well, thank you, Chris. It's been a great conversation. Really nice to know a bit more about your approach too. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. See you later.